for workforce readiness and employability. And this is the first in a series that's devoted to disseminating sector-specific analysis that's tied to the systematic review that came out several months ago, looking at PYD in LMICs. And as part of that systematic review, there was a series of sector-specific analysis done to look at the evidence base for PYD within specific sectors. So today's webinar is looking at the analysis that was done in the workforce development sector. And there was a brief that was developed for that. That's going to be much of the discussion today, along with a focus on a couple projects that demonstrate many of the findings of the brief. So as many of you know, this webinar is organized through one of the communities of practice under Youth Power Learning, which is a task order under the Evidence and Evaluation IDIQ, which is one of 2 USAID-funded IDIQs devoted to supporting positive youth development programming. Youth Power Learning is focused on generating and disseminating knowledge about positive youth development and cross-sectoral approaches to youth development. And major activities include creating a learning platform, leading communities of practice in key areas related to positive youth development, research and evaluation. So this is one of those major areas of activities. This is organized under the Community of Practice for Cross-Sectoral Skills, I believe. It's really a demonstration of USAID's commitment to positive youth development and integrating positive youth development approaches into our programming. So I'm going to get into our agenda a little bit, but I'm going to save some of the more detailed discussion of what is positive youth development for our first presenters. But the agenda is going to be focused around first a presentation of the summary findings from the Workforce Readiness and Employability brief. And that's going to be presented by Caitlin Moss and Daniel Clout, who are both program officers with Results for Development. And they were part of writing the systematic review and the brief. And then we're going to hear from 2 of the projects, as I said, who are highlighted in the review, and whose projects are workforce readiness programs and youth programs. And those are Balika and Ganar. We're going to have Dr. Sajida Amin, who's a Senior Associate at Population Council, speak about Balika, and we're going to have Anna Barrett, who's a Senior Program Officer at Partnership of America, speak about Ganar. And then we're going to open it up for questions and have a little bit of a discussion. I'll start us off, and then hoping that participants out there can chime in with questions and comments. So please save your questions for the end. If you have any concerns, comments, go ahead and put them in the chat box. So I'm just going to hand it over now to Caitlin and Daniel to focus on the Workforce Readiness Employability brief.
Great. Thanks, Nancy, so much for that introduction. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar. I want to welcome all of you who have joined our webinars in the past, but also anybody who's new. As you know, we at Youth Power hold a number of different webinars related to positive youth developing programming and overall the USAID investments in youth. This one in particular, as Nancy mentioned, is focused on this workforce readiness and employability frame, and really it is based on findings from our systematic review of positive youth development in low-income countries that, as Nancy mentioned, Caitlin and I contributed to, along with colleagues from ICRW, the University of Washington, the University of Melbourne, and it's been recently published. And what we've done here is create a brief that really focuses in on the findings related to workforce readiness and employability. And we hope that those are going to be useful to you as folks who are interested in that space and working to develop youth skills for workforce and employability purposes. And so Caitlin and I, my colleague Caitlin and I are going to go through some of our brief findings today. We will not go through everything. There's a lot of detail here, so we encourage you to download it and check it out for yourselves. We have a link to it at the end of the presentation, but we are going to basically just skim over through some of the key findings. And so I'll start by talking a little bit about what positive youth development is and how we've defined it, both through Youth Power and for this particular review. I'll touch a little bit on our methodology for the review so you know where this data is coming from and what we did to get it. And then I'll go through some of our findings with Caitlin and close out with some conclusions and recommendations for folks working in that space. So to start off, I want to introduce this concept of PYD, positive youth development. I think this is something that we probably have varying ranges of understanding of in the virtual room that we have today. And so we're going to start pretty basic, but we think it's an important concept, and it's really at the key of this research and of youth power. The headline is positive youth development is positive, as the name implies, proactive and holistic. It's an approach that, as defined by USAID and Youth Power, engages youth along with their families, communities, and their governments so that youth are empowered to reach their full potential. PYD approaches build skills, assets, and competencies, foster healthy relationships, strengthen the environment, and transform systems. What that really means in practice is that PYD is an approach that transitions away from more traditional approaches to youth development that see youth in a sort of problem or risk frame. And so instead of seeing youth as a risk, it really seeks to build on assets and positive assets of those youth so that you can improve the quality of life of those youth as well as the community around them. The idea is that if youth have the adequate knowledge, skills, and support, that their sector-specific outcomes are really that their life outcomes will improve, that their health might improve, that their economic success, their ability to have economic success will improve, and really the engagement with their communities will also improve. So this is a very holistic approach. PYD is really best understood when you think about the domains, 4 different domains that it's trying to impact and trying to build on, and those are assets, agency, contribution, and enabling environment. And these cross-cutting domains really are what PYD and positive youth development approaches are trying to build. When it comes to assets, we're really talking about do youth have the right resources or skills to be successful and to accomplish their goals. Agency is the ability of youth to actually use those assets and leverage those assets in order to set their own goals, to make their own decisions about their lives, and to push forward with those. When we talk about contribution, we're talking about youth's ability to contribute to their own communities and improve those. And finally, with enabling environment, we're really talking about youth being part of a community that recognizes their value, recognizes their worth, supports them in their endeavors, and really is there for them to help them grow. So these are the 4 sort of cross-cutting domains that PYD programming is based on and really is at the core of what that approach does. To jump in a little bit to the methodology of the systematic review, just so you are aware of where this comes from, the systematic review that we conducted along with our colleagues really aims to answer 2 questions. The first is, how have positive youth development approaches been implemented in low and middle income countries? This is an approach that's been largely implemented in the U.S. and in the global north. We wanted to know a little bit more about how it happens in low and middle income countries and what the impact has been. The second question is really about that evidence part and the impact. What do we know about these approaches? How impactful have they been? What sort of outcomes have we seen from them? So that we can all be aware of where they're happening and how effective they are. There's a lot of detail here about our methodology that I won't go through, including a little bit about our scope, how we tested the quality of each evaluation, how we identified the literature. But really the big picture is that we reviewed a large number of literature, both gray literature and peer-reviewed academic literature. And what we ended up after our systematic review process is 108 reports on 97 different positive youth development programs that were implemented across 60 countries. And so we extracted the data from that to get to where we are today and to get to the findings that we have now for workforce readiness and employability. Talk a little bit about how we actually define those workforce readiness programs. I think the the sort of cross-sectoral nature of PYD makes this a little bit of a challenge to conceptualize, but really when we talk about PYD, we talk about programs that work across sectors and we work to influence different outcomes along youth lives. And so within that, a program can be tagged as workforce readiness and employability if really any component of it is seeking to improve employability outcomes, economic growth among youth that it's treating. And so what that means is that the programs that we've highlighted today, and as you see by our other presenters from Balika and Ganar, they might not necessarily only focus on employability outcomes. They might have a health focus as well, or gender equity focus. But that's the nature of PYD. The nature of PYD is to be cross-sectoral and to be cross-cutting. And so they were still considered as workforce readiness and employability programs because one significant part of them actually intended to work towards that particular outcome. So that's the main gist about our methodology for the systematic review. What we've done here today is developed a brief that is really focused on the sector-specific findings around workforce readiness and employability. And we'll go through some of the findings now. Again, the brief that's available online is a lot more detailed, and so we hope that you will download that and learn from it as well. To start off, I want to talk a little bit about that first question about where have PYD programs been implemented in low and middle income countries. And so we see that overall we have workforce readiness and employability programs make up about a third of all of the PYD programs that we identified in the systematic review. And they're actually being implemented in 20 different countries, and you can see on the map there that the spread is pretty global. We do see a sort of concentration in sub-Saharan Africa with 15 programs being implemented within sub-Saharan Africa. As far as sectors go, we see that the programs that were tagged as workforce readiness and employability, many of them were also tagged in other sectors. Again, that cross-sectoral nature of PYD makes it so that a program can be working across different outcomes in different sectors. And so out of the 33 programs that we tagged as workforce readiness and employability programs, 23 of them also focused on global health, 21 of them focused on democracy and governance, and 20 also on education. Moving on to those domains that I introduced earlier and to the spread there, I think one of the interesting findings with the systematic review overall is that we see a lot of focus on assets, and that's very much true also in workforce readiness and employability. We had all 33 programs that we identified working towards those outcomes had some component that actually focused on assets. And so when we talk about assets, again, we're talking about the resources and skills and competencies needed to achieve desired outcomes for youth, and that can include technical skills training, formal education, academic achievement, training on life skills and interpersonal skills. And so all of the programs that we identified as workforce readiness and employability focus on building those particular kinds of competencies among youth. We see that also agency was a domain that was focused on by 25 of the 33 programs, enabling environment 23, and fewer contribution focused interventions in the workforce readiness and employability area, and that's pretty much consistent with, as you can see on the graph, with some of the other PYD programs that we identified as well. So now I'll hand it over to my colleague Caitlin, who's going to discuss a little bit more about the implementers of these programs and the settings in which they're implementing them.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Great, and thanks so much, Daniel, for giving us that introduction to what we found through the systematic review about workforce readiness and employability. So keeping us going here, we wanted to take a look, in addition to kind of the geographic spread of the workforce readiness and employability programs, also to where those programs, to what settings those programs are implemented in. So wanted to highlight a few things here. Most of the programs that we found related to workforce readiness and employability do take place in community-based settings. And when I say community-based settings here, we mean things like community centers, CBOs, public spaces, so all all of those different types are kind of encompassed within that term. And that's in contrast to the majority of PYD programs which we found were implemented in schools. In terms of who is doing the implementing, most workforce readiness and employability programs we found are implemented by NGOs. And I think one other interesting thing to note here is that 13 out of the 33 workforce programs have been implemented across multiple settings. I think that is important because we know youth are having to navigate different environments in their lives, and building the skills and the assets that they need and doing so across settings really helps them be better prepared to kind of continue to navigate those in life. Moving on now, I want to talk about PYD programs and the types of activities that we saw them use. So we wanted to look at not just kind of where are they and what are the outcomes, but also what does the actual programming look like. I think here we found that workforce readiness and employability programs, in contrast to some of the other PYD programs we looked at, tended to work a bit less with parents and teachers and instead focused more on direct service provision, educational activities that might have been led by a trainer or another adult. And I think that just speaks to, this is an area where we might be able to experiment with some other more innovative approaches, things like peer education, interacting with parents and teachers, and engaging other adults in the community as well. Interestingly and encouragingly, we saw that many of the programs implemented 4 or more of the different activity types that are listed there, which I think speaks to the fact that these programs are coming at the challenges that youth face from multiple angles and trying to engage them in multiple different ways. In terms of gender, when we looked at the workforce readiness and employability programs, we see that about 2/3 of them served both young men and young women. And I think what we're sort of seeing is that many of them did touch on gender issues in some form, but as we'll hear from Sajida about Balika later, I think there's real power in bringing a gender focus and that lens where programs really think through the barriers that youth are facing that might be tied to gender in order to inform the way that they develop their programming. And so I think that's something that we started to see a little bit of here, but we also are looking to see more often as well. And now we get to that second question that Daniel mentioned that our systematic review was designed to address. And so here we want to highlight what we found in terms of evidence with workforce readiness and employability programs. I think overall we found in the systematic review that only about 36% of our reports had experimental or quasi-experimental studies, and the same is true of only 26% of workforce readiness and employability. So in general, we didn't see quite as much evidence as we were hoping to, and that is even more true for the workforce readiness and employability space. And you'll see in that pie chart on the right there that not quite half of the programs actually did not have an evaluation, and so the documents that we were looking at there were more qualitative research, sometimes process evaluations or other program documents that describe the nature of the program. And so I think this just, is something for us all to be aware of in terms of the level of evidence that we're working with. I think, it's promising to be able to look at those programs that do have experimental or quasi-experimental evidence and see what they're finding, and yet we still need more. So we'll just keep that in mind, and I think that's kind of an important point as we look at this slide, which has quite a few things on there. Just a couple things to highlight, though, in terms of the actual outcomes that we're looking at. So of course, given that these are workforce readiness and employability programs, many of them did see positive outcomes in relation to workforce, things like increases in assets and earnings, increased positive financial behaviors like savings, duration of employment, and work experience. So those are some of the positive outcomes along the workforce lines that we saw. In addition, because many of these programs also have a health component, a gender component, or are addressing youth needs beyond just workforce, we also saw some positive outcomes there related to adolescent sexual and reproductive health, as well as gender, which we'll hear more about from our colleagues at Balika. And with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Daniel, who's going to walk us through our conclusions and some recommendations as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. I think we wanted to wrap up the presentation with a quick summary of what we found, again, just to review the big picture, and then also talk a little bit about the recommendations that we have, both for implementers, but also for funders, researchers, and policymakers. I think, in summary, I think we see that the PYD programs that we found that were classified as workforce readiness and employability are prevalent in low and middle income countries, and they work across sectors and domains. We saw them in about 20 countries. We saw them working largely on assets, but also on the different domains, including enabling environment and agency. And we also saw them working across sectors a whole lot. I think it's encouraging to see that we actually found them having an impact on employability outcomes and workforce readiness outcomes, as we mentioned, but we also really saw them having an impact elsewhere. And so we saw programs like Stepping Stones and Balika having an impact across different parts of youth life that don't have to do with youth and workforce readiness. And that includes gender equity, for example, which we see is really a sort of testament to the holistic side of PYD and how important it is to develop youth holistically. And then finally, we see a really significant evidence gap. Again, as Caitlin mentioned, we saw only a third of all PYD programs had experimental or quasi-experimental studies that we were able to find for the review, even less than that for the workforce readiness and employability. And so we see that as an area that's really needed, expanding investment and research on those programs. Just to go through a few of our recommendations quickly, I think one of the big findings that we found related to PYD is that actually a lot of our programs did not recognize themselves as PYD programs or did not identify themselves as PYD programs. And that included a lot of these workforce readiness and employability programs. And so for those of you out there who are implementing programs that feel like PYD programs that really look like it based on our definition of it today, the recommendation here is that you should be, there's information for you to leverage. There are resources. There are others who are doing similar approaches. And so there's a lot to go on there for those workforce readiness and employability programs to grow on from the PYD literature, from PYD programs. I think one thing particular to highlight that we saw more with other PYD programs was, when we talked a little bit about activity, you see that some more innovative approaches like peer education and activities with parents and teachers were not as favored as they were in other PYD programs within the workforce readiness and employability ones. And so there's a potential there for those implementers to leverage those activities a little bit more because they're promising. As far as some other recommendations, I think, recommendation for funders generally is to invest in high quality, rigorous evaluations of these programs. I think we know a little bit about how they work and how impacted they've been based on the review, but I think there's a lot more out there that we should know about how well they're working, how impactful they've been, and so I think that there's a high need for investment and evaluation. I think that there is also a need for investing in more programs that show impact in cross-sectoral outcomes, and we see that again with some of our workforce readiness and employability examples, but we see that proven models could be expanded and replicated for more impact. And then finally, we want to point out some of the tools and resources that we've started to create here at Youth Power, including a Youth Power Learning PYD Measurement Toolkit, which really has a lot of indicators for measuring PYD outcomes. For those of you who think you're implementing a PYD program, I think this is a great place to start looking. We really want to get more data on these indicators and really want to have a better understanding of how PYD programs are being impactful. So this is the tool for that, and it's something that we're really proud of over here at Youth Power, and I think it's something that can definitely be leveraged to improve programs across the world. So that's our summary of our brief. We have the brief itself is available for download on Youth Power. We have the systematic review. The complete report is also available for download. We have the PYD measurement toolkit as well, and we have a couple other resources from Youth Power Action, including a an RFA for integrated workforce development and sexual reproductive health. And we have a couple other reports from Youth Power Action as well, talking a little bit about that cross-sectoral nature of these programs and how they can be impactful. These are all available online. You don't have to worry about getting these links right now. The presentation will be available for download shortly after we are done here today, so you can access all of those then. But I'm going to quickly hand it over to Nancy again, who's going to introduce our presenter from Balika.
Hi. Yes, so as we said, we want to hear from a couple projects that demonstrate some of the best practices that the brief has highlighted and some of the lessons and strategies that are relevant to PYD in workforce programs. So we're going to hear first from Dr. Amin from Population Council talking about Balika, and then we'll hear from Ganar and Anna Barrett. Sajida?
Hi, can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. And you can see me. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be engaged in this conversation about positive youth development. As was mentioned, Balika is one of those cases where we didn't think of ourselves as in quite those terms, but this language and these descriptions and the philosophy of positive youth development is definitely relevant for us, and it's great to be recognized as such. So Balika is a word in Bangla and Sanskrit which means young girl, and it's an acronym for our project, which is an association for life skills, income, and knowledge for adolescents. So the purpose of Balika, the objective of Balika was to generate rigorous evidence on programs to delay marriage. In Bangladesh, Bangladesh is a setting where a lot has been achieved in terms of reproductive health, education, other health indicators, but we remain some of the earliest marriage hotspots of the world. The highest rates of under 15 marriage and the fourth highest rates of under 18 marriage in the world. So what we have been doing at the Population Council is organizing projects to generate evidence on a range of outcomes, and Balika happens to be one that's focused on delayed marriage. So the setting for Balika is, and the context in which we work, we know quite a bit about what the correlates of marriage are and what the drivers of early marriage are, and poverty is definitely a very basic driver of marriage. It's in any given setting, child marriage is higher among the poorest in the community, and we documented that in our baseline. There is not much evidence in terms of what works to address child marriage globally. Various systematic reviews done by colleagues at ICRW have shown that, out of many studies that attempt to address child marriage, only 11 collected the same level of rigorous evidence, and only 6 showed impact. And the ones that showed impact were all in the genre of incentivizing behavior change. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to go beyond an approach to incentivize to address some of these underlying drivers of child marriage, recognizing that there is always an economic component, but seeking to understand what other than incentivizing sort of small behaviors through delays in marriage timing could be done. And our approach was to focus on a variety of skills to address, to really kind of, rather than expand opportunities with a view, with an understanding that the child marriage was a response to the absence of opportunities and positive opportunities for young girls. So our approach was to address issues of a failure to aspire for young girls and offer opportunities by that are alternative, that could be seen as alternative pathways by the girls and their communities. And that particular approach was to build assets in a variety of ways and to see which kind of assets made the most difference. So basically addressing child marriage, the drivers of child marriage rather than the incidents. So I should mention that in Bangladesh, unlike many other settings where child marriage is common, we've had laws against child marriage since 1929. So there has been that kind of normative and legal approach to try and address this without very much effect. So what about the role of aspirations? Within even the child marriage literature, there are actually several studies that hint strongly why aspirations and how aspirations are important. So one was a study done by Jensen, which offered, the intervention was basically to offer information about business processing outsourcing and employment in that sector for young women in communities in a randomized trial, which demonstrated impact not just on marriage but on various other behaviors, with basically parents changing their attitudes and expectations about marriage. There is also in India another study that exploited a natural experiment where communities were required to elect female leaders that also showed very positive change for outcomes for young girls, including for aspirations related to marriage. And finally, there are other studies that showed similarly that changes in aspirations, changes in information about the outside world has impact on behaviors like acceptance of violence against women. So the Balika program has a holistic approach. It has a component that emphasizes skills development offered in a safe space. Among the skills that we offer, we include sexual and reproductive health information using something called the It's All One curriculum that has an emphasis on kind of critical thinking and promoting negotiation skills and those aspects of sexual and reproductive health and realization of rights, rather than kind of the more standard practice of offering information and access. We had livelihoods and we have education. I'll say more about those in a minute. But we also, in all of those arms, we had a series of activities to try and engage communities and families at various levels. And then the program interacted and targeted with the girls at the center, but also their parents and community leaders and community institutions. So this study was done in as a randomized control trial with 4 arms, a pure control arm where we just did the baseline and endline and no intervention at all, so no engagement in the control comparison villages. The 3 intervention arms differed in terms of the skill emphasis given to girls. So one intervention arm had specific support for tutoring to promote success in school and prevent school dropout. 2 emphasized gender rights awareness training and an approach to working collectively, promoting negotiation skills, etc. for girls with a specific emphasis on kind of having discussions about marriages that were arranged or felt forced, etc., or picking a partner. And arm 3 was the livelihood skills training program, which was divided up into 5 or 6 components depending on the village and included the philosophy of the skills program and was basically to give a sampler of positive employment options in the community. And the reason why we didn't have more specific, we kind of offered more generic exposure and knowledge skills with a view to changing aspirations about how young women can earn a living. So emphasis on non-traditional skills, but also locally relevant and available. and recognizing that most of the girls who were coming to these skills training centers were the younger girls. So even though the project reached 9,000 girls between the ages of 12 and 18, the highest participation rates was among the youngest girls. So 12 to 13-year-olds, it's about 70% of them participated, and it dropped to less than 20% for the oldest age group. So we knew that there was selectivity in participation, and the girls who were more successfully participating were the youngest ones. So we really kind of designed the program with a focus on readiness at very early stages, and with an emphasis on very generic rather than specific skills, because the experience in Bangladesh in terms of preparing and offering adolescent skills has been that providing something very specific, for instance, BRAC does, poultry raising training, or training in various kinds of crafts, basically has limitations of market, and it's not sustainable on a large scale, and even when it is, it's sort of markets can't hold it. So we wanted essentially to design a program that provided broad exposure to a range of pathways through which young people can access employment. The intervention had several common features that are important to emphasize. One was basic life skills training and SRHR informational education. We had a strong emphasis and kind of consciously promoted the skills training using ICT support. So we offered computers, we offered digital exercises as much as possible, and kind of there was this emphasis on technology with the idea that that is what would make the training, would give the training a very concrete identity and would make it attractive for young people themselves and for the people who need to, who are gatekeepers for this. And then we had a lot of activities on community awareness and community engagement. So just to summarize, there was the basic Balika Center, which is situated usually in a space within the community that was within a very easy walkable distance for the girls. Most of the time it was the primary school that the girls went to. These were secondary school age girls for the most part. There was community mobilization in terms of parent meetings, in terms of community organizers being engaged. There was use of technology, as I said, and as part of our sustainability strategy, we engaged in a different way with the community, with this notion that we wanted to, during the course of the project, we wanted to ensure that the community would take it up for the future and continue for future generations. And so we had these conversations around how that community ownership could be brought about. So I've described this component about the 3 intervention strategies. Education, which offered tutoring support in math and English, which we identified based on kind of success rates in national exams, livelihood skills training, and gender rights awareness training. So the livelihood skills had a health component, a basic computing component, which taught things like Microsoft Excel, Word use, and as well as web search capabilities. We also had a session on photography, which is a very popular option for girls because girls are one of the rising sectors of aspiration is journalism, and photography gives an option to develop that. And we also had various kinds of mobile-based, web-based accessing of services like mobile banking, and actually doing mobile recharge, talk time recharge as a business. And then we had some emphasis on entrepreneurship training. So the resources we used, and I think the central one was that we had a part-time teacher and a mentor from the local community who was trained intensively to run the skills center, but who also played a very critical role as a role model from the community and as a connector to the community. The use of technology, the use of computers and tablets and phones, as well as developing training materials to be used through this technology platform. We also offered books and offered relevant equipment for those sectors. So Balika was, all three arms showed significantly lower chances of child marriage, which was our main objective, and similars, and there weren't statistically significant differences in the average of the program's impact on girls. We measured impact for the community as a whole, not just for the membership, and we also looked at impact between members and non-members. So of course, among members, the decline in child marriage was greater, but there was also in the livelihoods arm a diffusion of impact beyond members. There was impact, but the impact was really sort of across the board, across sectors, in a range of different categories. I'll highlight here the impact on learning outcomes and on school dropout rates, so which in all of the arms reduced by about 20%, and was statistically significant, and the differences between arms were not. There was an improvement in mathematical competency that we assessed with quite a detailed module. And surprisingly, we found that there was an increase in income earning. I want to remind people that we actually didn't have any direct engagement in income earning activities. But what we found as we were implementing the program is these girls, when they acquired skills, they were likely to take up activities that involve tutoring other kids, which is one of the major sources of income earning for young people anyway in these communities, particularly if they have an education. And that likely the source of increased income earning. We also saw, which I don't show here, that there was an impact on wages earned. So to summarize, we found significant impact relative to control in all three arms on child marriage, school enrollment, a host of gender attitudes, a host of health behaviors, and in income earning through workforce participation. In the livelihood arm, we have this specific impact when we differentiate impact between members and non-members. We see that that's the one arm where the impact on child marriage diffused to non-members as well, and it didn't with the education and gender attitudes. And we're exploring through qualitative and other analysis what might explain it, but I speculate that it's because the livelihood training program had more of a demonstration effect, which is why it spilled over. And I think there's sort of indications in other programs as well that that is a mechanism that works in my livelihood. So as with the general recommendations of the PYD approach, we have several recommendations. So it's important to design programs based on a context analysis and what works and what doesn't, and what are salient features of the context. Teach girls early while they're still in school, which is the case here, provide skills, create girl-centered platforms, engage the community, employ mentors and trusted adults and engage them, and use technology as a way of making programs attractive. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hi. So thank you so much, Dr. Amin. That's lots of food for thought that we'll hopefully touch on when we have a discussion after this. So Anna, would you like to go ahead and talk about Ganar?
Sure, thanks. So So I hope everyone can see and hear me okay. My name is Anna Barrett, and I work with the Ganar program at Partners of the Americas. And we are a program that does youth workforce development through sport. So Partners of the Americas is an international nonprofit organization that's based in Washington, D.C., and we connect people and organizations across borders to serve and to change lives through lasting partnerships. All of our work is focused in Latin America and the Caribbean. And since 2005, Partners of the Americas has been running the Ganar program in this region. So what exactly is Ganar? Ganar is our award-winning methodology that uses sport to teach low-income youth the following 6 skills: respect, teamwork, discipline, communication, focus on results, and continued self-improvement. And the whole goal is to transfer these skills from the field to the workplace and helping youth find a job. So our mission is to prepare youth in Latin America and the Caribbean for 3 main outcomes: to find a job, go back to school, or start their own business. So who exactly are we working with? As you'll see in my next slide, we've worked all over Latin America and the Caribbean. So we always say that we target at-risk youth from ages 16 to 24. But the concept of what at-risk means across 19 different countries really varies. So that's where our collaboration with local organizations really comes into play. So we work locally with either nonprofit organizations or at times secondary schools or vocational schools to identify those members in their community, those youth that would benefit the most from this program. But in general, across the region, we work with youth who are from economically disadvantaged backgrounds and underserved communities, and are either unemployed or underemployed and are motivated to participate in our program because it is in general a 7 to 9 month program, and that's a really significant time investment. So finding people who are ready and motivated to put in and are able to put in the time with our program is very important. I think we get a lot of questions about gender and who we're working with on that side of things. In general, we strive to have our programs work 50% with girls and 50% with boys. At times, we have had a more heavily male population just due to local dynamics. I do think that the impression of a sports-based program is often in many countries that more male youth will be interested. But on the flip side of that, and partially to counteract that as well, we have done female-only groups, which have also really looked at the specific barriers to entry that women face. But in general, we're trying to work with the population that is neither in school or at work, the NINIs. And for the most part across the region, we've been working with either high school dropouts or youth that have completed secondary school but haven't had any options of what to do next. So we started in 2005 in 3 countries: Brazil, Ecuador, and Uruguay. As you can see in the map in the presentation, we've spread throughout Latin America and the Caribbean to 19 different countries. So obviously the context of our program has looked slightly different in each of these countries, and adapting to the local context and the local needs and the local organizations is something that's very key to our work, especially when you're talking about labor markets as well and how those can vary across the region. We started in a partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank. It came from a conference where the soccer player Pele was there, and he said, why aren't we using sports to connect with some of these people who aren't working or aren't in school? How can we use this supremely powerful tool of sport to reach some of these youth that haven't been able to be reached through the formal education system or other interventions along those lines? So since then, after starting through the Inter-American Development Bank, we've worked with USAID and a variety of other funders as well. So how exactly does Ganar work? Our goal is to take skills that you learn on the sports field through our curriculum, which is not pure sport, but sports-based activities, kind of part of the growing field of sports-based youth development. So taking these sports skills and teaching youth how they can then be applied in the workspace. So taking something that youth know really well in sport and applying it to something that they may not know at all, which is the work world. And so each of our activities starts with a sport activity, connects it to their lives, and then connects it to the labor market that we hope that they will enter after our program. I think I'm going to just take a second to talk briefly about sport and the role. I think that using sport for development is becoming more widespread and a more popular method of reaching youth. But obviously for us it's something that it's not just a game, it's something that truly is a tool. And it's being used by a variety of different organizations, whether for social inclusion, gender equity, health outcomes, and leadership. And just as we're talking about workforce readiness in this specific webinar, for us it's an amazing opportunity to have situations come up that would apply in the workforce as well. And so not only do we talk about these youth skills, but also our sports-based curriculum gives them a chance to practice them in a setting that they can then apply later. So a teamwork activity or communication activity. Sport really brings out some of these situations where they have a chance to practice some of the same skills that they will need in the workforce. It's also a lot of fun, and so that's definitely something that our participants say about our curriculum. So how it works. We are a 4-phase methodology. We start with 100 hours of sports-based employability training, our phase 1, and that focuses on the 6 core life skills, life and employability skills, so teamwork, communication, focus on results, discipline, respect, and continuous self-improvement. And how we got to these skills is when the program started in 2005. In one of our launch countries, we actually went to a variety of business leaders and said, what are your employees or employee applicants missing? Not the hard skills, but what are they missing to really make them good employees within your business? And these were the 6 main themes that came out in our conversations with business leaders. And so these are the skills that we focus on that can really be found in the world of sport and also are very important towards being able to enter the world of work and really succeed in the world of work. So phase 1 is divided in between classroom and field activities and are run by local facilitators in our organizations. And we've really found that these facilitators are key to the program, and the relationships that they form with the youth are really key to everything that follows from there. In phase 2, they take the soft skills that they've developed in phase 1, and they develop a different vocational or technical skill. So we partner with local vocational or technical trainers or training schools to offer a market-driven technical training. So basically making sure that in each country we are offering a training for these youth that has a place in the labor market, that there are jobs available for them on the outside of our program. In phase 3, we take the soft skills from phase 1, combine them with the hard skills from phase 2, and put them in either internships, apprenticeships, basically a practical work experience, a chance where they are able to take everything that they've learned so far and really try it in a real world environment. So this involves a lot of partnerships with local businesses who are willing to take on youth for usually around 80 hours of supervised work experience. After phase 3, they are considered to have graduated from our program, and phase 4 is more of a follow-on, less formal phase, helping these youth who have been in our program from 7 to 9 months take the next step into hopefully the work world, sometimes continued training or school, and other times starting their own business as well. And then 2 things, as you can see, coming up the side of our pyramid that are actually really important to our training as well are the concepts of mentorship and service learning. The first, mentorship, really gives our youth an opportunity to connect to people in their community who have already succeeded in the work world, and offering them an outlet, whether it's one-on-one mentoring or small group mentoring, to interact with someone in their community who is succeeding professionally. And whether they had that role model or that resource to talk to before, that's something that's very important to our program. And the final thing that stands throughout is the concept of service learning or community service, which is really important for us because one thing that we've noticed with it is that it really helps youth redefine their interactions and their place in their community. So how can they, who may have never had a job, interact with their community in a really positive way and see that they can be a positive force in their community. And so that's something that we've really focused on in community service throughout the program. So looking at our impact, just starting with how we've tracked kind of internally our impact. So we've worked with over 16,000 youth across Latin America and the Caribbean over the last 12 years. Of those who start our program, about 65 to 70% of participants graduate from the program, meaning they complete the first 3 phases. And of those who graduate from the program, about 65 to 70% of them obtain formal employment, return to school, or start their own business within 1 year of completing the program. So that we, in general, stay in touch with youth throughout their first year out of the program, offering both support in terms of making the next step, but also tracking, hey, where are you now? Have you found a job? What can we do to help you take that next step? And going back to the community service side of things, Ganar youth have completed over 145,000 hours of community service as well. So that's been a lot of our internal monitoring data. And then recently, during our USAID program, USAID funded a 2-country impact evaluation in Guatemala and Honduras, with the main research question being, to what extent does participation and completion of the Ganar program increase the likelihood that youth will obtain and maintain jobs, return to school, start their own business, or reduce risky behavior? So this was an external evaluation conducted by Social Impact, but with a randomized control trial between groups who are getting our program, Ganar, in Guatemala and Honduras, and control groups in both of those countries who were just on the job market looking for jobs but weren't getting any of our programs. So this is actually still ongoing. I know we've talked a lot so far about the importance of having impact evaluations and research to really look into what's working within this field. So especially in Guatemala, they still haven't collected end-line data, but they have given initial presentations on the work in Honduras. So some of the key findings is that Ganar led to really significant improvements in youth job quality. So while actually the employment rates weren't necessarily that different between the control, they weren't statistically significant in the difference between the control group and the Ganar group. The youth that had been through our program had higher salaries, better benefits, and were more likely to be happy with their jobs. So in terms of job quality, we made significant jumps there. And then positive results in some of the intermediate outcomes, personal strength, supportive social environment, better self-reported professional capabilities, even if they hadn't necessarily had an increase in their job, they all felt like they had really improved in the skills that they needed in order to get a job, with the primary, or one of the main ones there being able to, their CV writing had drastically improved. And then on the qualitative side, which was conducted with focus groups and also a series of interviews with select participants, they had really strong socio-emotional impacts. So the personal strength side, the supportive social environment, self-esteem, and things like that were things that we found really had improved for our youth over the course of the program, which is something that we really think is really important for each of the youth that comes through our program, especially given the environment that many of them have come from, and that really links back to where I started in terms of the role of the facilitator and how these vital relationships form, and what a support structure that can be for the youth as well. So as I mentioned, Guatemala is still collecting data, and so we don't really have full results in terms of what this evaluation will show, but these are some of the initial findings that we're sharing right now. So that's actually it for me today. Just a couple of quotes from some of our participants about how, not only are they prepared to enter the workforce after our program, but it's going to make them better employees and hopefully actually better people in the long run and as well. So I think that's all from me. Happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was great. I think we've heard or been following the impact evaluation of Ganar over the past years now. So, oops, I'm sharing my screen. There we go. So it's great to have kind of follow-up details to fill in some of the other presentations that have been made about the program recently. So I'm going to just kind of make a few comments broadly about maybe Daniel and Caitlin's work that they highlighted, and then shift into some questions for the two projects, because there are a couple connecting points I wanted to make from the brief. One is that just to highlight that much of what was highlighted in the brief also connects to other work that we've been supporting under Youth Power Action. So, for example, you may recall that last year we released a paper that was looking at integrated reproductive health and workforce development programming and evidence about what works in those types of programs. And so this brief really does match or complement nicely that paper. And in fact, out of that paper, there was a theory of change that was put forward that was supposed to kind of represent the key components of successful reproductive health and workforce development programs. And many of the components in that theory of change we see here reflected in this research. So it's nice to see that complementarity. Speaking largely to the enabling environment realm in the PYD framework. So the theory of change from that paper looked at healthy relationships, safe spaces, mentoring, working with communities, and so forth. So we see that as something that not only is in some of these workforce programs, but also the ones that have the strongest outcomes. So that's a good thing. The other thing that comes from the brief, as many of you heard me say, and we certainly are everyone's making this message that we need more rigorous evaluation. So I'm not going to dwell on that anymore. I think that's well established, and there are several efforts, including this mechanism, underway to try to strengthen the evidence base. But another effort underway to get at that issue is the follow-on to the paper that I was just talking about. And I think Caitlin cited, or Daniel cited, a link earlier in the presentation to the RFA that was recently released under Youth Power Action, calling for project proposals that were integrated reproductive health and workforce development programs. So the idea is to try to strengthen the evidence base around integrated reproductive health and workforce programs in particular, by supporting some pilots, and then with additional funding that we'll be identifying, conduct an impact evaluation on those. So that's just one example of a program that, or an effort to try to get more evidence around PYD and workforce. So I'm happy about that. So we're trying to put into place some initiatives that respond to this call for more evidence. The other comment I wanted to just make that I thought was kind of interesting in looking at the findings from the brief is the issue of the contribution element having the fewest programs represented. And just wanted to kind of call attention to that because I think there's certainly been a lot of discussion over the past year plus about the need to look at youth engagement as a major component in workforce programs, particularly in conflict-affected and violence-affected contexts, and that skills training and job placement is not necessarily, or there isn't yet any definitive evidence that shows that that is the factor that can have a mitigating effect on young people being drawn to violence and violent groups. So looking at this role of youth engagement is something that we're taking more seriously, and yet the evidence, at least that was available for this review, shows that there have not been that many programs yet that have integrated that element into workforce programs, and or yet have not done that much evaluation of that. So there are certainly several that are out there, but probably too new to have been included in the review. So I think it's really important for us to be gathering more data from those programs going forward so we can inform this discussion. So yeah, so I just think that's interesting that still not yet a lot of practice, but it is it is being discussed a lot. So hopefully that will come. So I have just a few questions of my own, and then we're going to go through the ones that you guys have submitted so far and the ones that are coming in you haven't yet seen. But I'm going to ask one question to everyone, and I'll let Daniel, Caitlin, and Anna, and Sajida chime in for whoever wants to kind of take the stab at it. But I mean, one challenge that I see in this work is that the traditional workforce program is more oriented for formal sector wage economy opportunities, really doesn't prioritize deliberately positive youth development interventions. Whether you're looking at the budget or the staffing or expertise who are working on the project, or whether you're even collecting data around it, if you're doing it deliberately or not, there's often not evaluation around it or monitoring, so we can't really say that much about it, which I think speaks to some of the challenges that the brief highlighted. Most of the value is in the time that's spent on job placement and skills training. So how do we get workforce programs, more traditional ones, to take this more seriously? I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I'd love to hear from the speakers today. How do we really get this prioritized and not just seen as a nice to have? So I'll pitch that out there to everyone. I don't know. I'm sitting next to Daniel and Caitlin. Maybe they can chime in, but I'd love to hear from any of the speakers to start us off.
I can take it. This is Anna. I can take a stab at that one. I think that for us, I think that we did have really strong positive youth development outcomes, and I think at times that we actually felt like we weren't necessarily, or I think that our evaluation shows that perhaps we were actually doing really well at these PYD concepts, and perhaps even more emphasis could have been placed on the employment side of things. And so I think that one thing that's important there is actually, and I think you mentioned the budget and the outcomes, is those are such powerful tools when looking at these programs, and really from a program development and a funder side of things is making sure that it's explicit throughout, that when you're having a program that is making kind of really focusing on positive youth development, even though I think those outcomes are generally harder to measure than maybe a job placement, but the making sure that throughout the program development and outcome measurements, that those are as valued as indicators or outcomes of job placement and those things.
I can also jump in there and just say that from our perspective, I think it's a really good question. I think what we saw is a lot of, I think there are a lot of programs out there that could easily implement some PYD components to them as well that might not to. And I think part of the mission of Youth Power is really sort of enlightening and making sure that folks understand what that looks like and what that means. And so with the PYD toolkit, the measurement toolkit, I think we can think about how folks that might already have an impact on PYD outcomes, maybe they're not aware of it, they could actually have a sense of that too. So the flip side of that question is also true, that I think there are a lot of programs that really are already having an impact and that maybe just haven't captured it. I think Anna's point is really interesting, and I think that in theory, realistically, if PYD is going to be effective, it's going to be a holistic approach to youth, and it's going to develop them across different dimensions. And I think a lot of the translation to employability outcomes might also be sort of long-term based on that. I think skills that you develop through PYD may not manifest immediately in the job placement opportunity, but I think that generally down the road it can. And I think thinking about measuring and assessing those longer-term outcomes, thinking about how the sort of more holistic development of youth can have a longer-term impact in their life as well as in the broader community is a really interesting challenge. Our perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this challenge of realistically, there's that pressure. Whether it's from the national government that's getting pressure to say we need to have some progress made in terms of youth employment and the youth unemployment challenge in our country. So there's that, or whether it's from the donor or Congress, show that we're actually placing young people or giving jobs and giving them economic opportunities. But balancing that with, well, we also want some broader well-being outcomes for young people that we're reaching that go beyond just do they have some job at the end point of the project. So, and a lot of that will come from more research to show that this makes a difference. So, that's, I guess, my take on it. I don't know. Anyone else has more to offer? I'll let you guys chime in. Let me kind of segue to the next question, which is somewhat similar, perhaps, but this is for Dr. Amin. The Balika project has gotten really showcased in a lot of the work that we've been doing under Youth Power, which says a lot about the program and the strategies that it's used for reaching young women and achieving the outcomes that Dr. Amin highlighted today are really ones that we should be looking at to integrate into other non-gender-specific workforce programs. And I guess that's my question is, so much of the more traditional workforce programs, particularly more formal sector oriented, but also just those that don't target young women, don't have as much of a gender focus and don't make this effort to try to include strategies to get at some of these other sociocultural factors that are impacting young women's educational and professional decisions. So how can we get traditional programs to take up some of these strategies or mainstream them, so to speak? And I'd love to hear from Dr. Amin or others if suggestions. And then, from those of you out there online, if you have thoughts.
So it is a huge challenge because whenever the conversation shifts from this kind of reproductive health or gender-focused strategies to something that's real or smart economics or something that the government cares about in terms of employment generation, we kind of have people revert to business as usual. I would say that the way to make the connection and kind of to move both types of programming, ones that are more positive development oriented and ones that are more employment oriented, towards some common skills that are relevant for both as kind of a bridging mechanism. And by that I mean things that from the employment perspective would be considered foundational skills. And I'm sure those will differ in different contexts, but I think what we find ourselves talking about most at the POP Council when we talk about these livelihood skills are one sort of generic financial capabilities that have implications for positive youth development as well in terms of teaching, discipline, budgeting, planning, etc., in addition to specific financial education. And in our program, and I think we've done this in a couple of other settings also with quite positive results, the emphasis on new technologies and access to new technologies and skills that have similar implications in terms of boosting confidence and self-efficacy for young people, but also may be then seen as skills that are desired in the marketplace. I did long ago, 20 years ago, I did a study on garment workers, which employs primarily young women, and some of this notion comes from how garment workers position themselves or kind of emphasize the novelty or the newness or of what they were doing. You know, and I think technology offers that same kind of technology skills offers that same kind of effect. And I think in most settings, and definitely in Bangladesh, in terms of poverty, the potential digital divide of those who have access to technology and have the ability to develop those skills and those who don't is one way of kind of building it into traditional programs.
Okay, sorry. Thanks, Sajida. Yeah, I think this is an ongoing challenge, but I mean there are ways to do it if I think implementers and the funders are building this in from the beginning and aware of it. But I want to turn it over to some of your questions that you've been sending in. I'm going to start with the top of some of the earlier ones. Just and then I'm going to hand some of these over. So we had a question from Kate asking about a resource library for the work readiness programs that are being implemented. I'll attempt to touch on this, and then I may let Maria Brindlemeyer kind of chat in, or she doesn't have a microphone, but she can answer. But I'm not sure, maybe she can. Right? She's sitting next to me also. So the youthpower.org website is trying to capture much of the materials on youth programming, and so that's getting bigger and bigger every week, so that's exciting. In terms of workforce development and work readiness programs in particular, we have another program called Workforce Connections, also USAID funded, that has been active for the past 4 or so years, and we're going to be, while that's still an active program, we're going to be transferring much of that content over to the youthpower.org website, so it'll try to capture some of the, better capture more of the workforce development content. But I'll let Maria answer if she can, maybe by chat. Or Kate, if you have follow-up questions, if I didn't answer, let me know. in terms of some of the questions regarding soft skills, I think Laura was asking a variety of different questions. I'll try to answer some of those. I mean, I think one of them was about, are there technical skills that benefit from stronger soft skills or not? I mean, I do think that there is, at least in terms of practice, practitioners have learned that, yes, there are sectors that require certain soft skills in particular, whether it's hospitality industry needing communication skills or problem solving, what have you. So I think a lot of the programs end up prioritizing some soft skills or tailoring those for the sectors in which they're targeting to place people in jobs. So I do think that has happened. And some deliberately, programs do that more deliberately than others. Then we had a question from Catherine about soft skills as well, asking about refining the discourse around soft skills and the variation of the terms. Yes, I think this is widely kind of a frustration that's widely shared. I think we have attempted to do that through some of the work under Youth Power Action, in which the terms have been attempted to be kind of honed into just a few core terms. And if you are familiar with some of the research and products that have been conducted and developed under Youth Power Action, as well as Workforce Connections, there are some research papers that you could turn to if you that try to do this. So we can point you to those as well. But I think we are trying to gently settle around the term soft skills, but we understand that within the different contexts of working in health programming versus workforce programming, sometimes life skills are more preferable to employability skills or soft skills. So it's been a hard hard process to settle on just one term for that. But a lot of the work that's been done under Youth Power Action in particular does kind of help move us forward, I think. So if you're not familiar with that, we can certainly point you to that. There's some specific questions that I thought may be better for Balika and Ganar to answer. So I don't know, Sajida, if you saw Laura's question about religious groups and their role in promoting gender rights. I don't know if you'd like to take that one on. And then, then also there's a question from Maria about desertion, whether that was an issue when you're offering training or programming that's more than 10 hours. Sajida, would you want to take on either of those questions?
I'm not sure that, so in Bangladesh there is an approach to engaging religious schools, but that's been at the level of bringing madrasas into a formal school system and recognizing madrasa education. And there's been some impact. I was involved in a study that compared formal madrasas that are recognized to non-formal madrasas and looked at outcomes, learning outcomes, as well as outcomes related to gender attitudes, etc. So there's some benefits from engaging like that. And of course, there's a lot of evidence on in the family planning world on using the religious community to promote positive change. So our approach was with the religious groups was not to exclude them, but to include them in the same way that we would include any other gatekeeper in the community. We didn't see any specific promise to actually seeking their endorsement, but basically took the approach that we wanted their endorsement for the program as well as other potential gatekeepers.
Anna, do you want to talk at all about desertion? Was that an issue for Ganar, meaning dropouts, I'm assuming?
Sure, yeah. We usually say say that about 25% of the people of the youth who start our program likely won't make it through, and this is due to a variety of factors. I mean, I think that the length of our program is somewhat prohibitive in some ways. I think that while obviously our data shows better outcomes in terms of quality of jobs and benefits and those things, I think that taking yourself largely off the job market for 7 to 9 months, especially in places that rely so heavily on the informal economy where you could make money for a few weeks, but that doesn't really work well with our program participation, does lead to a certain level of dropouts, as do, and this I think affects more frequently our female participants' responsibilities at home, domestic responsibilities, and just having to be there on a more consistent basis. So while we realize that having a 100% graduation rate from our program is unlikely, we did do a couple of things to help support these youth. I think that one being providing transport stipends and at times also time stipends to the youth so that at least they weren't losing money on participating in the program. So something that made it economically viable for them in the short run when they could have gotten an informal job for a few weeks, but trying to keep them really involved for the duration of the 7 to 9 months with the outcome of having a better employment outcome and trajectory moving forward. And I think specifically looking at our female-only programs, really going into that not being aware of the full kind of scope of their responsibilities, and in some cases being able to offer either child care or additional flexibility on scheduling as we work to adapt to the situations that each of our youth were coming from. I think, overall we weren't able to adapt to every situation, and dropouts were still a problem, but definitely offering that extra level of support did help more youth complete the program.
Thanks. That's helpful. So we're getting close to the end of our session. I just wanted to call it, there was a question from Charlotte about can we elaborate a little bit about how the projects measured socio-emotional impacts of the programs. So maybe Anna and Sajida, you can maybe respond to that in the chat function. But I wanted to kind of turn it over to Daniel to help wrap up, but in doing that, respond to a question that we thought was a good kind of wrap-up question, because there was a question about health outcomes from Caroline and health outcomes that we looked at in the systematic review and what we found. And I think that is a nice way to lead into what Daniel can tell us about next steps.
Perfect. Thank you, Nancy. It's great to see that we had a lot of questions coming in through chat, and so I think we were trying to answer to a few of them in the chat box, so if folks want to look back at that, I think we addressed a lot of the questions there, including some questions about soft skills and their applicability to the workforce, and as well as the question about how we sort of classified our research and the evaluations that we found through the systematic review. I think to the question that you mentioned, Nancy, about health outcomes from the systematic review, so again, this webinar and this brief that we're launching really today only slice the data across that particular sector, and we have obviously tons more that we can learn from that data set, and so we'll be releasing a brief on the health outcomes in particular, as well as a webinar on the health outcomes, and we'll also be releasing a brief on the outcomes related to democracy, governance, and conflict mitigation. So that's coming up in the next few months, and I think the spoiler alert for all of you who are interested in global health is that there's actually a lot of impact of PYD programs on global health. It's actually the sector that we saw the most interesting and sort of rigorous impact, and I think including in HIV and sexual reproductive health. And so if you can't wait for that and want to know about that now, you can download the report on the Youth Power website. I think, again, the link is going to be here for that. But we'll definitely be focusing on that in the next brief and webinar. I think just to wrap up, what we're doing here today. I think we want to just thank you all for being part of our webinar. As I mentioned before, we've done several of these now with Youth Power Learning, and we always find it a really enriching experience, and hope that folks learn from it as well. I think some next steps for engagement, if folks are new to Youth Power and want to join, obviously there's always social media that you can use to promote our research and our message, and as well as highlight your own. I think that we have, as Nancy mentioned earlier, communities of practice across a number of different topics, including cross-sectoral skills. And so if you'd like to join one of those communities, hop onto youthpower.org and submit your email there. And we really have fostered, I think, some vibrant communities around these topics, and I think it's been really enriching to learn from each other. There's a lot on youthpower.org, including a ton of resources, including the Youth Power resources and Youth Power Action resources, but also many others that you can download. You can also engage via our grant under contract mechanisms, and so we'll periodically put out RFPs on grants under contract that can be bid on that have to do with Youth Power work, and a lot of them are tied directly to these Youth Power communities of practice. There is the RFA that Nancy mentioned as well through Youth Power Action. That is also a way to engage. And then finally, register on our Learning Hub online and get access to a lot of the different resources that we're publishing there on youthpower.org. So feel free to connect with us that way. We are on social media at YP Learning on Twitter and on Facebook as well. We will be sharing the recording of this webinar in the next couple of days, and also the slides so that you can connect and click on all the links that we have available. But just to wrap up, to thank everyone, including the presenters, as well as Nancy for facilitating, and our team from Youth Power Learning who's here helping us coordinate. And thank you all for attending. We'll see you guys next time.